Say cheese, Grandpa and Grandma. Emily grinned, holding up her mom's tablet with both hands, her fingers barely reaching the shutter button. The 8-year-old's tiny braids bounced as she stood on tiptoes, trying to capture the perfect shot of her great-grandparents, Mr. Mathew and Madam Mary. Mathew blinked twice behind his thick glasses. Cheese? I thought we were having jollof rice, he muttered under his breath. Smile, Mathew, not grumble, Mary said, nudging him gently with her elbow. She fixed her gelly with practiced grace, her gold earrings dancing in the sunlight. This is Emily's day. It wasn't just any birthday. May 31st had become a legendary date in the family, Emily's birthday, Mathew and Mary's wedding anniversary, and the eve of their shared birthday weekend. Mathew would be turning 97, and Mary, 92. Even more incredible? They had been married for 72 years. That's longer than some empires lasted. The entire house was bustling with relatives, children dashing through the hallway with cake crumbs on their shirts, teenagers pretending not to be on their phones, and aunties and uncles gossiping in clusters like chickens pecking at old secrets. The family had come from near and far, drawn like moths to the glow of celebration, and of course, the promise of Mary's pepper soup and Mathew's semi-annual attempt to tell the world's longest dad joke. I still don't get why everyone says we look alike, Mary mumbled after the flash went off. You do, Emily chirped. You look like twin raisins. That drew a chorus of laughter. Mathew slapped his thigh. Twin raisins. I like this girl. She's sharp. Mary rolled her eyes but smiled. There was something about this moment, surrounded by 4 generations, balloons hanging lopsided, the smell of fried plantain in the air, and love, imperfect but persistent, that made her chest ache a little. Not from old age. From memory. She glanced sideways at Mathew. His hand was resting on his walking cane, fingers curled with the weight of years, but his eyes still danced when he looked at her. Just like they did when they first met. 72 years, Mary whispered to herself. And still taking cheesy pictures. Mathew looked at her and winked. And we still haven't figured out how to take a good one. Everyone laughed. But deep down, Mary felt a tremble, a whisper from the past, a feeling she thought she buried long ago. Tomorrow was going to be special. But tonight was going to be unforgettable. Grandma, Grandpa, Emily squinted at them, her finger hovering over the camera button again. Why do you two look like twins? That question stopped everyone mid-sip and mid-gossip. Even the teenagers paused their TikTok scrolling. Mary blinked. Twins. Yeah, Emily said with full confidence. Same wrinkly cheeks. Same way your eyes squint when you smile. And you both even have matching frowns when I don't share my cake. Mathew let out a deep chuckle, the kind that made his shoulders bounce. Well, I suppose if you stare at someone for 72 years straight, you eventually start to morph. Mary tilted her head. The word twins tugged at something old, something sweet and aching in her chest. Oh, they used to call us that, remember? She said, her voice softening. Mathew smiled, and for a brief moment, his face seemed 70 years younger. Ah, those days. The living room slowly faded in her mind as she drifted into memory, back to when she and Mathew were barely out of their teens. University campus. Dusty shoes. Mathew always beside her, books in one hand, her water flask in the other. We did everything together, Mary whispered. He wasn't just my classmate. He was my partner. My backup plan. She chuckled, my fake boyfriend. Fake what? Emily asked, peering up suspiciously. Oh yes, Mary said, her eyes dancing. Whenever my parents got suspicious, like, who is she seeing? Mathew would just show up and pretend to be the one. They liked him, you see. Loved me, actually, Mathew corrected. Your mum used to cook for me more than she cooked for you. Because you were so painfully polite. Mary rolled her eyes. You said thank you 5 times before drinking a cup of tea. Politeness was all I had. You, on the other hand, were all fire and jazz. Everyone laughed again. The kids didn't understand half the story, but they could feel the warmth behind it. That kind of love, that long, long love, was rare. Tangible. But as the moment passed, Mary's smile faded a little. Because deep beneath the nostalgia was a flicker of guilt. A question she never truly answered, even to herself. Why did they want Mathew for her so badly? What did they see that she didn't, at least not at first? And why did she keep looking elsewhere, even after she had him? Mathew was perfect. That was the problem. Mary sat beside him that evening, her fingers resting lightly on the folds of her wrapper as laughter echoed in from the other room. Emily had dragged two of her cousins into an intense game of musical chairs, complete with dramatic falls and fake injuries. Mary wasn't paying much attention. Instead, her mind wandered to the Mathew of years past. Handsome. Brilliant. Always smelling faintly of dust, books, and palm oil. He never shouted, never slammed a door, never raised his voice, even when she deserved it. Especially when she deserved it. He was a safe harbor. So safe, it became too quiet. Even now, as he sat next to her, his eyes soft, his smile gentle, he hadn't changed. He never did. And somehow, that was comforting and infuriating all at once. I remember when Donald slapped me at the student union, she said suddenly. Mathew blinked, surprised by the memory. You still remember that goat? Mary chuckled, but it was dry. He was loud. Unpredictable. Exciting. He made my heart beat like a talking drum. Mathew didn't flinch. And I gave him a nosebleed. You did, she said, turning to him. You always showed up. You always needed someone to, he replied simply. That silence returned again, soft, forgiving. The kind that lets you breathe but also chokes you when you're looking for passion instead of peace. I never deserved you, she muttered. Mathew gave a small shrug. That was never the point. And that was what had always undone her. Even when she made foolish choices. Even when she fell, stumbled, broke things that shouldn't be broken, Mathew never threw it in her face. He simply held space for her to return, like an open gate that never asked why you left. But back then it drove her mad. She was fire. He was rain. She didn't want calm, she wanted a storm. And Mathew, with his gentle love, felt like a lullaby when she was craving fireworks. So, she found chaos elsewhere. And still, it was Mathew who stood in front of her family, telling them she wasn't a lost girl, just misunderstood. Still, it was Mathew who kept defending her from herself. And she had always wondered, why? Why did he stay? And even more haunting, why didn't she leave? Mary had always been the lot. She knew it too. Even as a little girl, she'd been the one climbing trees in her Sunday dress, sneaking into the boys' football matches, dancing to high-life music with bare feet while her parents shouted from the veranda. Mathew? He was the boy sitting by the gate, reading a dusty novel and pretending not to watch her. He'd always been the stillness to her whirlwind. And she hated it, until she loved it. You were too calm, you know, she told him once years ago. Like river water that never spills. And you were thunder in a teacup, he'd replied, smiling. That was their rhythm. Mary chased the world, and Mathew waited for her to return. She was bold. Sharp-tongued. She laughed too loud in church and danced too hard at weddings. Life, to her, was a banquet and she refused to sit at the children's table. While Mathew was content with simple routines and quiet evenings, Mary wanted more color, more adventure, more stories to tell. The world outside their home always called her name. But somehow, no matter how far she ran, she always came back to the quiet hum of their shared space. Mathew never chased her. That was the strange part. He never pulled, never begged, never tried to box her in. He simply remained, steady, open, annoyingly understanding. She didn't understand how he could do that. How someone could love without trying to possess. It felt unfair. It felt undeserved. And yet, after every wild idea and every impulsive detour, whether it was joining a local theater group, becoming a hairdresser for 2 weeks, or trying to start a mobile suya business that failed in under 48 hours, it was always Mathew who'd be there at the end of the day. With her slippers waiting at the door. Her dinner plate still warm. The light in the hallway still on. She'd never said thank you. Not really. Because deep inside, some small voice kept whispering. Is this it? She had fire in her belly and peace in her home. And sometimes, the peace felt like a prison made of pillows, soft, silent, and suffocating. It wasn't supposed to happen. They were only 23. It was after one of those loud campus parties, the kind with too many students squeezed into too small a compound, the music loud enough to rattle cutlery inside neighboring kitchens. Mary had been dancing all night, barefoot in the dirt, her laughter rising above the drums. Mathew was there too, of course, leaning against a wall, sipping his Coke, watching her the way he always did. Not possessive. Not judging. Reliable. She had argued with Henry earlier that evening. He had shown up with someone else, claimed it was just a friend, then disappeared into the dark with her. Mary had tried to laugh it off. Pretended not to care. But by the end of the night she felt hollow. Mathew offered to walk her back to her hostel. The streets were quiet. The air was thick. Their laughter was light at first. Then the silence crept in. Mary still couldn't explain it, not even to herself. Maybe it was the frustration, the loneliness, the ache to feel chosen for once. Or maybe it was the way Mathew looked at her when she said, "I'm tired of being everyone's second choice." That was the night it happened. No promises. No flowers. No grand confessions. Just a quiet entanglement of two people with too many unspoken emotions. A one-night mistake that refused to fade with the morning light. 2 weeks later, she missed her period. In those days, getting pregnant before marriage wasn't just a family scandal, it was a spiritual earthquake. Her parents were furious. Neighbors whispered. Aunties gathered like prayer warriors. Mathew didn't flinch. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even wait for her to say a word. He simply showed up one morning with a ring, cheap, slightly oversized, but sincere. "I'll take care of everything," he said. Mary remembered staring at it in silence. Her heart didn't flutter. There were no fireworks. Only the overwhelming weight of gratitude and guilt. She had expected a fight, a lecture, maybe even a disappearance. But instead, Mathew offered himself like a solution to a problem she had created. And deep down, that scared her more than the pregnancy. Because she knew, right from that moment, he deserved more than a woman who only married him to clean up a mess. Henry. Even now, the name had the power to burn. Mary hadn't spoken it in years, not even in her mind. She'd tucked it away like a rusted blade in an old drawer, sharp, but forgotten. Or so she thought. She remembered the first time she saw him. She had been standing in line at the old railway station in Ibadan, trying to catch a train that had already decided it would arrive when it pleased. Henry was behind her, humming a tune she couldn't place, whistling like someone who owned time. Tall, light-skinned, with eyes too bold for his own good and a swagger that made the air around him feel charged. He flirted like it was breathing, effortless, constant. He called her sunshine, even on rainy days. When he spoke, the world paused. Or maybe it was just her world. He made her feel seen, not just appreciated but devoured. And God help her, she liked it. While Mathew brought peace, Henry brought fire. And Mary had always been drawn to fire, even if it left her scorched. He was never hers in the way she wanted, though. He was always somewhere else. With someone else. Saying just enough to keep her close, never enough to make her his. And yet, every time he left, she waited. Every time he called, she answered. Even after marrying Mathew. She hated herself for that. But she didn't stop. There were no hotel rooms. No secret children. Just letters. Conversations. Flirtation that never quite died. A spark always threatening to become a flame. Mathew, of course, noticed. He never shouted. Never accused. But sometimes he'd pause when she left the room. Or say, "Be careful," a little too softly when she picked up the phone. He never said Henry's name. That was the worst part. He left her to drown in her own guilt without ever pressing her head under. One day, years into their marriage, he finally confronted her. They were folding laundry. 3 children asleep. The silence thick as harmattan dust. He said simply, "Are you still talking to him?" Mary didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence was a confession. She expected anger. She expected doors to slam, plates to shatter. But Mathew just kept folding a wrapper, smoothing out the edges like nothing had changed. "It's not serious," she mumbled finally. Mathew looked at her, not in rage but in deep sadness. "That's the problem," he said. "It never was serious. But it's always been real." She cried that night. Quietly. Into a pillow. Alone. And for a few months she stopped. But Henry had a way of finding his way back. A message at Christmas. A scribbled note sent through a mutual friend. A random afternoon call that made her heart skip in ways it never should have after marriage. She knew Henry didn't love her. Not the way she loved him. He never would. But that didn't stop her from loving him. It was a curse, really, falling so deeply for someone who never made space for you. Mathew, on the other hand, had built a home for her and stayed in it, even when she kept leaving through the back door. What kind of woman does that? She often asked herself. She was a mother, a wife, a grandmother, a great-grandmother even. But part of her was still that reckless university girl who chased after the boy who never stayed. And every time she looked at Mathew, a part of her felt unworthy. Because she knew even then that Henry might have been the son, but Mathew was the one who stayed through every storm. The anniversary party was in full swing. Music poured from the living room speakers, classic highlife with a sprinkle of modern beats to keep the younger cousins interested. Aunties were plating jollof and fried chicken in paper trays. Uncles were laughing too loud. Emily's little brothers were running around with balloons tied to their wrists like they might float away if someone let go. Mary had just finished touching up her head wrap in front of the mirror when she heard the knock. "Don't scratch that." It wasn't a knock. It was chaos. The kids had stormed into her room during a game of hide and seek, giggling uncontrollably, and accidentally opened one of her old trunks, the wooden one she hadn't touched in decades. The one she thought was tucked safely under piles of wrapper cloths and old wedding photographs. They scattered the contents like wild squirrels. Cards, magazines, faded pictures, and worst of all, letters. So many letters. One of the children grabbed a handful and darted toward the hallway. "Emeka," she called sharply. "Drop that." "That's not." But he was already gone, laughing, thinking it was part of the game. She stood too quickly and winced. Her knees weren't what they used to be. As she rushed after them, heart racing, she almost bumped into Mathew. He was holding a bottle of champagne, dressed in his finest agbada, pale gold, with tiny embroidered patterns on the chest. His glasses sat crooked on his nose, and his walking stick leaned casually against the wall. There was a sparkle in his eyes, the kind he always wore during special moments. Until he looked down. In his free hand, Mathew now held a small, yellowed envelope. His thumb rested on the corner, frozen. "Mathew," Mary's voice cracked. "Please don't." But he had already opened it. He read in silence. The party sounds blurred around them. Somewhere in the background, someone yelled that the cake had arrived. But in that moment, time bent inward, just Mary, Mathew, and 40 years of unspoken weight crammed into one piece of paper. When he looked up at her, it wasn't rage she saw. It was something worse. Resignation. The kind that said, "I knew, but I hoped I was wrong." He handed her the rest of the envelope. There were dozens of them. All addressed to Henry. All written in her handwriting. Some as far back as their 30th wedding anniversary. Mathew didn't say much. He simply turned, placed the champagne bottle on the console table, and walked out the front door. Mary stood there, breathless. Her hands trembling as she gathered the letters into the box. She wanted to chase after him, to explain, but what would she even say? That it meant nothing? That it was a mistake? Again? The children came bouncing back in moments later, clueless. She smiled weakly, tucking the box away as fast as she could. An hour later, the living room was full. Everyone was waiting for Mathew. Emily had already placed the crown on her head, demanding everyone call her birthday chief. Someone had started recording on a phone. A toast was waiting. But Mathew was still gone. The murmurs started. Did Grandpa go upstairs? Maybe he stepped out to call someone? Mary sat stiffly in her chair, barely breathing. Then, finally, The door opened. Mathew entered. But he wasn't alone. By his side was a man in a sharp gray suit holding a briefcase. His face was unreadable. Mathew walked to the center of the room. "I want to thank you all for coming," he said. His voice was calm. Still strong, despite the age. "Today is a special day. But not for the reasons you think." He handed Mary a single sheet of paper. A divorce letter. Then he placed the box of letters at her feet. These were written over 40 years. 40 years. There were gasps. Someone stood up. The room split in half, between shock and silence. "I stayed because I believed I had her heart," Mathew said. "But it turns out I only had her loyalty. And sometimes that's not enough." With that, he turned toward the door, the lawyer following behind. No one said a word. The room was still. Mary's hands trembled around the divorce paper. Her voice caught in her throat. Her world, carefully balanced for over 70 years, had just collapsed. The night before the anniversary was unusually quiet. Mary sat on the edge of her bed, staring at nothing in particular. Her hands rested on her lap, gently fidgeting with the edges of her wrapper. Her room smelled faintly of lavender oil and old cedar, like memories that refused to fade. The sounds of celebration had died down, and for once, the house felt like a place of reflection, not noise. Emily's question from earlier still echoed in her head. "Grandma Mary, how did you and Grandpa make such a big family? Is that what true love looks like?" Mary had paused. She remembered looking at the child's wide eyes, so curious, so pure, and for a moment she had no words. But her silence said everything. From the corner of the room, Emily's mother had watched the exchange, her own eyes wet with quiet tears. To see her daughter so inspired by the legacy of her elders, it moved her. She had always thought of her mother as a woman of strength. Now, she saw her through a new lens, a builder of generations, a woman who had held everything together even when her own heart had been scattered. Mary hadn't answered Emily directly. Instead, she smiled and whispered, "You'll understand one day, my dear. But if you want a big family, you must start with a heart big enough to love more than just yourself." But even that answer haunted her. Because in truth, her heart hadn't always belonged to Mathew. That night, after everyone went to bed, Mary pulled out the box, the one she thought she'd never touch again. Inside were all the old letters. Henry's name stared up at her like a ghost. She read one. Then another. Her hand trembled. The words weren't even that romantic, just casual, playful, suggestive, but they reminded her of who she had once been, who she had chased, who she had almost sacrificed everything for. And then she looked at the room around her. Photos of her children, her grandchildren, Mathew's cane resting by the wardrobe, a framed note he once wrote her on their 50th anniversary that simply read, "You and I, still." Tears welled in her eyes. "What have I been doing?" she whispered. "I've been chasing shadows." She stood up, clutching the letters. Her heart beat fast, determined now. She opened the window, grabbed a small kerosene lamp, and moved toward the garden outside. But halfway through she paused. No, she wanted to do this right. She wanted to say goodbye properly. She walked back in. That was when the knock came. Knock, knock. She froze. "Firestorm," the voice said gently. "Can I come in?" Mathew, the only man who ever called her that. Firestorm. Because she was always setting things ablaze. Sometimes the right things, sometimes the wrong. Mary panicked. She shoved the letters under a wrapper on the floor, too carelessly. Her hands shook. Her breath caught. She wiped her face quickly. "Come in," she said. The door opened slowly, and Mathew stepped inside, holding 2 cups of warm cocoa. His smile was disarming. "So familiar. I just wanted to check on you. You disappeared after dinner," he said. Mary stared at him. That face. That man. For 70 years, he had stayed. Even when she didn't deserve it. Without thinking, she rushed forward and wrapped her arms around him. He nearly spilled the cocoa. "Well, this is new," he chuckled. She pulled back slightly and planted a soft kiss on his cheek. "You're the best thing I never chased," she whispered. He raised an eyebrow. "What's going on with you tonight?" Mary shook her head and smiled. "I'm just seeing clearly for the first time in a long time." Mathew sat on the bed with her, sipping his drink and telling her about Emily's plans to build a family bigger than Nigeria. They laughed. They talked. He didn't notice the wrapper on the floor. Neither of them brought up the past. In that moment, she thought she had finally done it. She had finally buried Henry for good. But fate, as always, has a cruel sense of timing. The next day, everything would unravel. Mathew would find the letters. And despite all her intentions, despite her decision to burn the past, it would be too late. Mathew sat alone in the small apartment. The one-bedroom flat he had moved into just days ago was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that didn't just fill a room, but pressed against your chest like a stone. He sat by the window, the blinds half-drawn, light pouring in stripes across the floor and over a table littered with old photographs. Some black and white, others faded with time. A few were in color, smiling children, birthdays, old church days, vacations by the beach. And at the center of it all, one picture stood propped up by a mug, he and Mary, on their 50th anniversary, holding hands like nothing had ever gone wrong. Mathew stared at it, his thumb gently tracing her smile. He wasn't angry anymore. Not even heartbroken. He just felt tired. He spoke to himself, not loudly, but with the slow cadence of a man unraveling years. Funny how they always say, good men don't finish last. But I did everything right. I showed up. I stayed. I never shouted, never strayed. I built a family. I built her peace. I gave her everything I had, and still, I was second in her heart. His voice trembled, but not from tears. From truth. I suppose being a man like me means loving without conditions, even when you're starving for something in return. You don't get rewarded for stability. You just get remembered when everything else falls apart. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. Peaceful men are like seatbelts. You only remember them when there's a crash. He leaned back in his chair, looking up at the ceiling. But I loved her. Lord knows I did. I don't regret it. Not even now. He closed his eyes. And quietly, he stopped speaking. Back at the family home, Mary sat in the living room beside her daughter, Emily's mom. Her eyes were swollen. Not from the party. From what had nearly been. I was going to burn them, she whispered. Last night. I was ready. I'd finally let Henry go. Her daughter held her hand, wiping silent tears. You don't have to explain, she said. I believe you. Mary shook her head. No, you must understand. For 70 years, I carried ghosts in my heart while Mathew carried me. And last night, when he came into that room, and he smiled and called me Firestorm again, I knew I had waited too long. She looked at her granddaughter playing in the yard. Tell Emily to always follow her heart, yes. But tell her the truth too, that the greatest gift life will ever offer is the chance to build something bigger than herself. A family. This family. Even with all the mistakes, it's worth everything. Then came the knock. A soft one. Just like the one Mathew had given the night before. Mary turned toward the door. Her daughter answered it. The look on her face said everything. Mom, she whispered, he's gone. Mary didn't cry at first. She didn't move. She didn't blink. Then slowly, her body curled in on itself, like paper crumbling under fire. And the sob that followed wasn't loud, but deep. The kind of cry that comes from the part of you that only love ever reaches. She had lost him. And worse, he had died thinking he was never truly chosen. 3 days later, Mary passed quietly in her sleep. She had written a note, found on her bedside table, sealed with trembling hands. To the man who never left me, even when I left him in my heart. Thank you for choosing me over and over when I never asked you to. Thank you for building our home, stone by stone, while I looked out the window. I see it now. You were my safest place, Mathew. And I should have fought for you the way you always fought for me. I hope God lets you rest the way you lived, in peace. Firestorm.
thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, you may never see us again. Subscribe now and turn on post notification for our next story.